Welcome to video 4.1 over the basics of chemical bonding. In this video, you're going to look at the difference between the different types of chemical bonds, specifically the two major types of bonds, ionic versus covalent bonds. In this video, you're also going to learn how to identify a chemical as whether it's a compound versus a molecule. And then you're also going to look at the electronegativity to understand what type of chemical bonds are present in a certain chemical compound. Here are the vocabulary terms we're going to cover. They should be used within the video, but at any time, go check Google if you would like a deeper explanation. Also, you will need your periodic table that I gave you in class and your calculator. So as we get started, chemical bonding is this concept of when atoms come together. In a sense, there's this electrical attraction between atoms that will allow them to bond to form a more stable compound. This electrical attraction is called a chemical bond. And then we've already learned about the octet rule, but just to remind you, the octet rule says that all atoms want 8 electrons in their outer shell, or wants 8 valence electrons. And so because that some atoms have electrons to give, or some have a desire to take electrons, there's going to be this sense where atoms will either learn to steal or give electrons, forming ions, thus making an ion compound, or atoms will learn just to share their electrons to form what's called a covalent bond. So again, these are the two main types of bonds out there, ionic bond versus covalent. Ionic bonds are made from ions. Ions, again, are when electrons are either being lost or gained, which forms a charge, and then these opposite charges on these different ions between the cations and anions will pull them together, much like magnets. And then a covalent bond, it's when atoms will share their electrons, thus obeying the octet rule in both situations. So when we look at this on a deeper level, an ionic bond is when you have an attraction between the cations and the anions. What happens is some atoms like to give up 1 or 2 or 3 electrons. Some atoms like to gain either 1, 2, or even 3, 4 electrons. When these atoms gain or lose electrons, they form these positive or negative charges, which are known as cations and anions. And then those opposite in charges will attract from each other, forming an ionic bond. And when an ionic bond is present, then you're going to have a chemical compound. So again, why is a compound called a compound? Because it has an ionic bond. This is an important idea here, and make sure you write that in your notes because that will come back over and over again. Just like why is something called a molecule? Well, a molecule is called a molecule because it's when chemicals, a chemical bond is a covalent bond. So when atoms share electrons, it's considered a molecule. When atoms are coming together because of 2 ions form, because electrons are either lost or gained, that forms a compound. Again, a key idea in understanding the terminology, but not too important quite yet. So again, a covalent bond is this idea where atoms will share electrons. So now the question is how? How do you know when 2 atoms come close to each other? How do you know when they will either steal or give electrons? And how will you know when they will share electrons? And it goes back to that concept of electronegativity. We learned about electronegativity last unit, and then we talked about how electronegativity is really just like the strength. It's like the bench press. It's like the strength that an atom has to take or to steal electrons from another atom. And so when you look at your periodic table, you can find that electronegativity, again, down there in the key, it's that top right number. But again, what it does is it tells me the strength that these atoms have to steal electrons. And so when we want to determine what type of bonds is being formed between 2 atoms, all we do is subtract or just look at the difference between those 2 atoms' electronegativity. And if the difference between those atoms' electronegativity falls in the range of 3.3 to 1.7, we're going to call that an ionic bond, and therefore that'll be called a chemical compound. If their difference falls between the 1.7 to 0.30 range, we're going to call that a polar covalent bond, which then therefore means that chemical would be called a molecule. And again, a polar covalent is this idea that when atoms are sharing electrons, there's still a little bit of difference in the strength between those two atoms. And so there's an uneven sharing of electrons, meaning one of the atoms' nucleuses is pulling the electrons just a tad closer, and it's going to create what we call a dipole moment, which is really just a fancy word for a partial charge. Ions have full charges. Polar covalent gives atoms a partial charge, which we'll see down the road. And then the third category is what's called a nonpolar covalent. This is when atoms are sharing electrons, but there's an equal or even sharing. So if two atoms that are exactly the same, like two oxygens, bond with each other, since their electronegativity is going to be the same, their difference is going to be zero, which means they're going to share the electrons evenly. Think of tug of war. If two identical twins play tug of war, they're not going to win. They're going to share that rope equally. And even if one's slightly stronger, but not much to make a difference, if it's still a less than 0.30 when you look at their difference, when you subtract those electronegativities, we're still going to call that a nonpolar covalent bond. So this is a really simple video, really simple concept. All you're doing is subtracting the difference of electronegativity to determine if a chemical bond is ionic, polar, or nonpolar. And then based on that kind of bond, label a chemical as either a compound or a molecule. So let's practice. So as we move forward, here's two practice problems. I'll do the first one with you, and then the second one you can do on your own. So determine the type of chemical bond between oxygen and calcium, and then also do the same between oxygen and nitrogen. So when oxygen and calcium bond with each other, oxygen is going to have a electronegativity of 3.44 actually, and you can find that again on the top right corner there of the key, which is right there. And then on this slide, we have it listed right there, 3.44. Calcium has electronegativity of 1. So remember, Linus Pauling came up with this idea, and when we measure these charges up, it gives a very easy way to determine and predict what kind of bonds chemicals will form. So all I do is take 3.44, subtract it by 1.00, and in this case, you're going to get 2.44. So now all I need to do is go back to that range. This is a range that you can start memorizing, but I'll show you in a secret where you can find this range at again. But again, 2.44 fits right here. And therefore, we're going to call this an ionic bond. Therefore, when oxygen and calcium bond together, it's going to form a compound. So it makes an ionic bond, and together it's going to be called a compound. And then down the road, that will have implications on how we name that. We would call that calcium oxide for now, but we'll learn that in the next few videos to come. All right, pause the video. Try this next one. Try to see if you can determine the type of bond between oxygen and nitrogen, and see if you can label that as either a compound or a molecule. Welcome back. All right, so again, here I just labeled this oxygen and calcium as a compound just to be more thorough. But down here, what should you have done? You should have took the difference between oxygen and nitrogen and their electronegativity. You should have got oxygen's electronegativity at 3.44. That could have came from this chart, or it could have came from the periodic table I gave you on the back. Subtract from there, you're going to get a difference of 0.40. Go back and look at your range. I see that 0.40 is what we call polar covalent. And so therefore, this would have what's called a polar covalent bond. I'm going to call PC for polar covalent. And then again, this would be called a molecule because again, it's bonded covalently. So really, that's it. Pretty easy idea. Atoms bond with each other to make a more stable compound or molecule. Atoms can form molecules of compounds through either ionic or covalent bonds. Remember, molecules come from covalent bonds. Compounds come from ionic bonds. And when we look at the difference in electronegativity, that determines what type of chemical bond is there. Have a great evening.